The air in Mr. Miller's office felt heavy that afternoon. I sat there, quietly looking at the legal documents spread across the mahogany desk. Then I looked at my wife. Linda, the numbers on those pages were daunting. $450,000. It was the weight of our mortgage, the weight of years of hard work, and it felt like a massive wall standing between us and the peace we had earned. It reminded me of something much older, something much larger. I am talking about a massive curtain, a barrier that stood 60 feet high and 30 feet wide. For centuries, it told people to stay back. It said that God was far away and we were not worthy to enter. But in one single moment of history, everything changed. That wall did not just crumble, it was torn apart. Now, before I reveal the incredible moment that changed our legal status forever, I would love to know, what beautiful city or state are you joining me from today? Please, leave a comment below. I truly enjoy reading about where everyone is from. Oh, and just a quick note. While I use this story to help us understand these big ideas, the message and the hope behind it are very real, and they are for you. I was sitting in my favorite armchair the other evening, just watching the sunset over the backyard. My wife, Linda, was knitting beside me, and our son-in-law, James, was asking me about some old history books I had on the shelf. We started talking about the ancient temple in Jerusalem, and specifically, that famous curtain known as the veil. You see, to understand how big our victory is today, we first have to understand how big the barrier used to be. Most of us think of a curtain as something light, something we might slide across a window to keep the morning sun out. But this was something else entirely. I told James to imagine a curtain rising 60 feet into the air. Now, think about that for a moment. 60 feet. If you go outside and stand in front of a 6-story building and you look all the way up to the top of the roof, that is how high this veil reached. It was a towering, massive, overwhelming wall of fabric. Then, there was the width. It was 30 feet wide. It covered the entrance like a giant, solid shield. But the most incredible detail, the one that always makes me pause, was its thickness. The ancient records tell us that the veil was as thick as the palm of a man's hand. I held my own hand up, right there in the living room, and I looked at my palm. I asked James to imagine layers upon layers of blue, and purple, and scarlet wool, all woven so tightly that no light could pass through it. It was not just a decoration, it was a boundary. It was a solid, physical, impenetrable wall for hundreds of years. That curtain stood as a constant reminder of the distance between the Creator and us. I told Linda. It was like having a giant keep out sign hanging right in the middle of your life. It represented a Ranjay Butcha farm, an unreachable boundary. It told every person who walked near it that they were not quite clean enough or good enough to enter. It felt a lot like that heavy feeling we get when we think about our own mistakes. It reminded me of the weight of that $450,000 mortgage we talked about earlier. It is that feeling of being on the outside, looking in. You know that peace is on the other side. You know that God is on the other side. But there is this 60-foot tall, palm-thick wall standing in your way. No human being could ever reach the top of that curtain to change it. No man had the strength to move something so heavy and so ancient. It was a barrier that had been there for generations. It was the ultimate symbol of our weakness, compared to God's greatness. As I sat there with my family, I realized that many of us still live our lives as if that 60-foot wall is still standing. We feel the weight of it every time we pray. We feel the thickness of it every time we feel guilty. We see it as a massive, solid wall of separation. But we have to remember those numbers. 60 feet high, 30 feet wide, thick as a palm. Because once you realize how impossible it was for a human to move that curtain, you will realize just how miraculous it was when it finally came down. The sun was beginning to dip lower behind the oak trees in our backyard, casting long, skinny shadows across the porch. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth of the mug in my hands. Linda was there too, her knitting needles clicking softly in a steady rhythm. It is funny how those small, everyday sounds can make you feel so safe. But as I sat there, my mind drifted back to that ancient temple in Jerusalem. I started thinking about why that massive curtain was there in the first place. I looked over at James, who was sitting on the steps, and I told him, "You know, James, that veil was not just a piece of art. It was a sign, a very clear, very loud sign back in the old days, in the time of the Old Testament. That veil served a purpose that is hard for us to wrap our heads around today. It was a keep-out sign. Now, when we see a sign like that on a fence or a gate, we usually think someone is being mean or stingy. We think they are trying to hide something they do not want to share. But this sign, this curtain, was actually there for protection. I explained it to my family this way. Imagine you are standing in front of a massive, high-voltage power station. There are signs everywhere saying, "Danger, do not enter." Those signs are not there because the power company is mean. They are there because the energy inside that station is so intense, so raw, and so powerful that a normal person could not survive the contact. That is what the holiness of God was like behind that veil. The Bible tells us that God is light, and in Him there is no darkness at all. But we, as human beings, we have darkness in us. We have our mistakes, our regrets, and our sins. And when absolute light meets darkness, the darkness vanishes. For a sinful human to walk into the unfiltered glory of a holy God, it would be like a moth flying into the center of the sun. So, the veil was there to keep people alive. It was a boundary of mercy. But, oh, the weight of that boundary. I told Sarah and James that for hundreds and hundreds of years, that curtain was a constant reminder of how far away we were. It was a symbol of spiritual isolation. It was a quarantine. Think about that word. Quarantine. We all know what that feels like, especially as we have gotten older. It is that feeling of being cut off, being separated for your own safety, but feeling the loneliness of it every single day. Once a year, just once, one man was allowed to go behind that curtain. He was the high priest. And let me tell you, he did not go in there with a smile on his face. He went in with fear. He went in with trembling. The ancient traditions say that they would actually tie a rope around the high priest's ankle before he stepped behind the veil. Can you imagine that? They tied a rope to him, just in case he was not pure enough, and the glory of God struck him down. Because if he died back there, no one else could go in to get him. They would have to pull his body out from under the curtain using that rope. That is how serious the separation was. The high priest would carry the blood of a sacrifice, a symbol of a life given to cover the mistakes of heavy atmosphere of the most holy place. He would perform the ritual, and then he would leave as quickly as he could. The message was clear. God is here, but you cannot come near. I told Linda that I remember feeling that way as a young man. I remember standing in the back of the church, looking up at the altar, and feeling like there was an invisible wall between the Lord and me. I felt like I had to be perfect to even say a prayer. I felt like I was standing on the outside of a beautiful home, looking through a thick, frosted glass window, seeing the light inside but shivering in the cold. That was the purpose of the veil. It told us that we were not ready. It told us that we were not clean. It told us that there was a gap, a massive, 60-foot-high gap that no human effort could ever bridge. It was a barrier of law, It was a barrier of tradition, and for centuries, it stood as the ultimate reminder that humanity was kept out. We lived in the outer court. We lived in the shadows. We lived with the knowledge that the thing we needed most, the presence of our Father, was the one thing we were not allowed to touch. It was a beautiful curtain. Yes, woven with the finest threads, decorated with golden cherubim, but to the heart of a person who wanted to know God. It was the most terrifying wall in the world. I paused and looked at my family. The crickets were starting to chirp in the grass. I wanted them to feel that weight. I wanted them to understand the keep out sign. Because, you see, you can never truly appreciate the joy of an open door until you have spent a lifetime standing in front of a locked one. The next morning, we were all gathered around the kitchen table. The smell of bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. It was a typical Saturday morning at our house, but on the corner of the table, sitting right next to the fruit bowl, was a stack of papers. They were the mortgage documents we had been reviewing with Mr. Miller. I looked at Sarah, my daughter, and I could see the worry in her eyes. She is a mother now, and she cares so much about the future of this family. She was looking at that number, $450,000, to a young family, and even to us, in our retirement. That is a mountain. It is a debt that feels like it owns you. I reached out and touched the edge of the paper. I looked at James, my son-in-law, and I said, "This number, right here, this $450,000, it reminds me of the veil." James looked a bit confused at first. He asked me how a bank loan could be like a temple curtain. I explained it to him. I told him that debt, whether it is financial debt or spiritual debt, creates the same feeling in the human heart. It creates a feeling of being unworthy. It creates a barrier. When you owe someone that much money, you do not feel like you can walk into their office and put your feet up on the desk. You do not feel like you are their best friend. You feel like a servant. You feel like you are under their thumb. Every time you see their name, you feel a little bit of shame, a little bit of pressure. That is exactly how we used to feel about God. Our mistakes, our failures, the things we said that we should not have said, the things we did that we regret, they all add up. It is like a ledger that is deep in the red. We look at the debt of our souls, and we realize we can never pay it back. I told Sarah, "Honey, when you look at this mortgage, you feel like you are not quite free yet. You feel like you have to work, and work, and work, just to stay even." And that is how many people try to handle God. We think that if we go to church enough, if we give enough money, if we are nice enough to our neighbors, maybe, just maybe, we can pay off a little bit of that spiritual debt. We think we can buy our way behind the curtain. But the debt is too high. It is $450,000, and we only have a few pennies in our pockets. I looked at Linda, my beautiful wife of so many years. I told the kids how Linda and I used to pray when we were first married. We would come to God with begging hearts. We would say, "Oh Lord, please, if you could just help us this once. We promise we will do better. We promise we will be more worthy." We were living in the outer court. We were living like strangers in our Father's house. The veil was not just a physical curtain in Jerusalem. It was a curtain in our own minds. It was a veil of unworthiness. We felt that as long as we were in debt, we had to stay far away. We thought that God was like a stern bank manager, sitting behind a big desk, waiting for us to make our next payment. I told James about the time I almost lost my first business. I remember the shame I felt. I did not want to see anyone. I did not want to go to church. I felt like I was a failure. And because I felt like a failure, I assumed God saw me as a failure, E2. That is what the veil does. It convinces you that your legal status is that of a debtor. But here is the thing I wanted my children to understand. The debt is real. The $450,000 is a real number. Our sins are real. The holiness of God is real. The distance was not an illusion, it was a legal, spiritual reality. I looked at my daughter and said, Sarah, imagine if someone walked into Mr. Miller's office and they signed a check for the full $450,000. Imagine if they handed you the deed to the house, stamped, paid in full. How would you walk then? I asked her. Her face changed. She smiled a little. She said she would walk with her head held high. She said she would not be afraid to answer the phone anymore. That is the transition. That is the shift from the Old Testament to the New. Before the curtain was torn, we were all looking at the debt. We were all looking at the keep out sign. We were all measuring our worthiness by our own performance. And let me tell you, my performance was never enough. Your performance is never enough. The veil stood there, 60 feet high, telling us that the price had not been paid. It stood there as a barrier to intimacy. It was the check denied sign of the ancient world. I told my family that we have to stop trying to sew the veil back together with our good works. We have to stop trying to pay a debt that has already been addressed by someone much richer than us. As we sat there at the kitchen table, with the morning light streaming in, I could see the message starting to sink in. The mortgage papers were still there, but they did not look so scary anymore, because we were talking about a victory that was bigger than any bank. We were talking about the moment the legal status of every human being on earth was changed. I told them. We are going to talk about the rip next. We are going to talk about the moment the bank was paid off. The curtain was torn, and the keep out sign was taken down forever. Linda reached over and squeezed my hand. We were not strangers anymore. We were not debtors. We were children. And it was time we started living like it. It was getting late. And the fire in the hearth was crackling softly, sending a warm orange glow across the living room. I looked at Sarah and James and my dear Linda. I wanted them to really hear me now, because we were moving from the problem of the veil to the solution that changed every soul on this planet. I told them. Imagine a Friday afternoon in Jerusalem. It was 3 o'clock, but it did not look like afternoon. The sky had turned as dark as midnight in December. The air was thick, heavy, and still. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. Up on a hill called Calvary, Jesus was hanging on a cross. He was the one who had lived a perfect life. He was the one who had no debt, no sin, no reason to be separated from the Father. But there he was, taking on the weight of every mistake we ever made. He was taking on that $450,000 debt we talked about, and every other debt from every person who ever lived. I asked James to think about the intensity of that moment. Jesus cried out, "It is finished." It was not a cry of defeat. It was not the whimper of a dying man. It was the shout of a victor who had just crossed the finish line. It was the sound of a legal contract being stamped paid in full. And right at that exact microsecond, something happened back in the city. In the temple, where the priests were busy with their rituals, a sound erupted that they would never forget. It was not a thunderclap. It was the sound of fabric. Massive, thick, palm-thick fabric being ripped apart. That 60-foot-high curtain. That beautiful, terrifying wall that had stood for generations was suddenly torn in two. I sat back in my chair and let that sink in for my family. I told them. Think about the shock of those priests. They had spent their whole lives being afraid of what was behind that curtain. They had spent their whole lives keeping people out. And suddenly, the room was open. The secret was out. The barrier was gone. This was the great turning point in cosmic history. Before that moment, you were a debtor. You were an outsider. You were someone who had to stay in the outer court because you were not worthy. But the moment that veil ripped, your legal status changed. You were no longer a defendant in a courtroom. You were a child in a living room. I told Sarah. Honey, it is like that mortgage we were worried about. Imagine the bank manager did not just tell you the debt was gone, but he actually tore up the contract right in front of your face. He shredded the papers. He threw them in the trash. That is what God did with the veil. It was a spiritual earthquake. The ground beneath the temple shook, but the real shaking happened in the hearts of men. For the first time in thousands of years, the most holy place was visible. The glory of God was no longer hidden behind a wall of wool and thread. It was unloosed. It was free. I told my family that we often forget how violent and powerful that rip was. It was a supernatural act. It happened exactly when the veil of Jesus' own body was torn open on the cross. His flesh was torn, so the temple curtain could be torn. His life was broken, so the barrier could be broken. As I told this to James, I could see him thinking deeply. I told him, James, you spend so much time trying to be a good man, a good provider, and that is wonderful. But you have to realize that no matter how good you are, you could never have walked through that curtain on your own. It took a cosmic event, a divine sacrifice, to open that door. The universe was different now. The rules had changed. The distance had been deleted. We were no longer living in a world of stay back. We were now living in a world of come in. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was ticking away. A simple, steady sound. I told my family that every tick of that clock since that Friday afternoon has been a tick of freedom. We are living in the after. After the rip. After the victory. The air in our living room felt different as we talked. The heaviness of the debt. The heaviness of the keep out sign. It was starting to evaporate. I wanted them to understand that this was not just a story in a dusty book. This was a legal reality. The debt of $450,000, and every other burden we carry, was settled at the moment of the rip. The way was open. Not because we found a key, but because God took the door off its hinges. And that, my dear family, is the greatest victory we will ever know. The next morning, over breakfast, we couldn't stop talking about it. Linda was pouring more coffee, and she asked me a question that really got me thinking. She said, Robert, why does the Bible make such a big deal about the fact that the curtain was torn from the top to the bottom? I smiled, because that is one of my favorite parts of the whole story. I told her, Linda, that is the most important detail of all. Think about the logistics of it. That curtain was 60 feet high. That is the height of a 6-story building. Now, imagine you are a man standing at the base of that curtain, even if you were the tallest man in Jerusalem. Even if you stood on your tiptoes, you could only reach maybe 7 or 8 feet up. If a human being were going to tear that curtain, they would have had to start at the bottom. They would have had to grab the hem, find a weak spot, and pull upward. But the Bible is very specific. It says the veil was rent in twain, from the top to the bottom. I asked James to picture it. James, there were no ladders in that room. There were no scaffolds. No man was standing 60 feet in the air with a pair of scissors. The fact that it started at the top means it was an act of God. It was the hand of the Father reaching down from heaven, grabbing the top of that heavy, thick fabric, and ripping it apart like it was nothing more than a piece of tissue paper. It was God saying, I am coming to you. This is the heart of the difference between religion and relationship. Religion is a man at the bottom of a 60-foot curtain, trying to jump high enough to reach the top. Religion is us trying to climb a ladder of good works to get to God. We try to be nicer. We try to pray longer. We try to be more holy. We are at the bottom, looking up, and feeling so very, very small. But the gospel, the good news, is God at the top, reaching down to the bottom. I told my family that this changes how we pray. It changes how we wake up in the morning. If the veil was torn from the top down, it means our access to God is not based on our effort. It is based on His initiative. It is not about how high we can jump. It is about how low He was willing to bend. I looked at Sarah. I know she sometimes feels like she is not doing enough as a Christian, I told her. Sarah, you could spend your whole life trying to reach the top of that 60-foot curtain. You could work yourself to exhaustion, and you would still be 50 feet short. But you do not have to reach the top, because God already tore it open from his side. Think about the thickness again, as thick as the palm of a man's hand, woven so tightly that horses tied to each side could not pull it apart. That is what ancient history tells us. It was an unbreakable barrier. And yet, when God decided the time was right, it tore like it was nothing. It was an act of divine power. But more than that, it was an act of divine love. I told Linda that this is why I feel so much peace sitting here on this porch in my old age. I am not worried about my performance anymore. I am not worried about whether I am reaching high enough. I am resting in the fact that the way is already open. God did not wait for us to get our lives together before he zitwarked the curtain. He did not wait for us to pay off that $450,000 debt. He did not wait for us to prove we were worthy. He saw us on the outside, shivering in our guilt, standing in the shadows, and he said, "No more." He reached down, he took that barrier of 60 feet, and he opened the way to himself. I told James, when you see a rip in a piece of clothing, you usually think something is broken, but this rip, this tear in the temple, it meant that the world was finally being mended. The broken relationship was being fixed. The distance was being closed. The top-to-bottom reality means that God is the primary actor in our lives. He is the one who initiates. He is the one who invites. Our only job, our only beautiful task, is to walk through the opening he made. We don't need to bring a needle and thread to try to sew it back together. We don't need to try to fix what he has already declared open. I told my family, let's just enjoy the view. The most holy place is no longer a secret. The heart of God is no longer a mystery, because the hand from heaven reached down and removed the last thing that was standing in our way. As we finished our breakfast, the room felt lighter. The sun was streaming through the kitchen window, and for the first time, it felt like there was no difference between the light in that room and the light of God's presence. The barrier was gone, and it was God himself who took it away. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the blinds of our living room, creating long, golden stripes on the carpet. I watched a few dust motes dancing in the light, and I turned to my son-in-law, James. We were still thinking about that massive 60-foot curtain being torn apart, but I wanted to talk to him about what that really meant for our daily lives. I told him, James, think about our meeting with Mr. Miller, our lawyer. When we wanted to discuss that $450,000 mortgage, we couldn't just walk into his private office, could we? James shook his head. He knew the drill. To see Mr. Miller, we had to call his secretary first. We had to make an appointment weeks in advance. When we arrived at the office, we had to sit in the waiting room, thumbing through old magazines, waiting for the door to open. Even then, there was a desk between the man who had the answers and us. There was always a middleman. There was always a gatekeeper. I leaned forward and said, that is exactly how the world worked before the veil was torn. In the old days, if you wanted to get God's attention, you couldn't just speak up from your kitchen table. You needed a mediator. You needed a priest. You had to bring your sacrifice to the temple, hand it over to a man who wore special robes, and hope that he was worthy enough to represent you. You were always standing on the outside, waiting for someone else to go in on your behalf. The priest was the secretary. The temple was the waiting room. And the veil, well, the veil was the closed door that you were never allowed to walk through. But when that curtain ripped from the top to the bottom, God was making a grand, cosmic announcement. He was saying that the office of the middleman was officially closed for business. I told my family that this is the first massive shift for every one of us. It is the end of the priesthood system. Now, Don't get me wrong. I love our pastor. I appreciate the men and women who study the word. But they are not my gatekeepers anymore. When the veil tore, every believer became a priest. I asked Sarah, my daughter, to imagine the freedom of that. I told her, Sarah, you don't need a religious expert to talk to God for you. You don't need to find someone more holy than you are to get a message through to the throne of the universe. I told them a story from when I was a young man, working in that old factory in Ohio. I remember feeling so overwhelmed by the pressures of life. I felt like my prayers were just hitting the ceiling. I thought I had to wait until Sunday morning so I could ask the minister to pray for me, because I assumed God would listen to him more than he would listen to a tired, dusty factory worker like me. But that was the veil talking. That was the old system trying to tell me I was still an outsider. The truth is, the moment that fabric was zetwark, a direct line was established. I told James, it is like having the private, personal cell phone number of the creator of all things. You don't have to go through a switchboard. You don't have to wait on hold. You don't have to explain yourself to a secretary. When you sit in your car, stressed about work, you have a direct line. When you wake up in the middle of the night, worried about your health, you have a direct line. When you are sitting in a lawyer's office, looking at a debt of $450,000, you have a direct line. I love the word intimacy. It means being truly known. Before the rip, we had distance. We had formality. We had rituals. But after the rip, we have a father, I told Linda. You know, when our grandkids want to talk to us, they don't make an appointment, do they? She laughed and said, Of course not. They just run through the front door and yell for Grandma. That is exactly what the torn veil gave us. The right to run through the door. I want you to feel the weight of that privilege. The high priest of Israel used to enter that room with a rope tied to his ankle, terrified that he might die in the presence of God. But you can enter that same presence while you are doing the dishes, or walking the dog, or sitting in your favorite chair. You are a priest now. You have been given the keys to the house. I told my family that we need to stop acting like we are still in the waiting room. We need to stop acting like we need a human being to give us permission to talk to our Father. The way is not just open, it is direct. As we sat there in the quiet of our home, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. I thought about all the years I spent feeling like a stranger to God, all the years I spent thinking I wasn't religious enough. But the torn veil tells a different story. It tells me that I am welcome. It tells me that I am heard. It tells me that the distance is gone and the intimacy has begun. I told James, don't ever let anyone tell you that you are not worthy to speak to God. The highest price in history was paid, and the thickest curtain in history was torn, just so you could have this direct line. We don't need a middleman. We have a Father, and he is waiting for us to call. After we finished talking about the direct line, I noticed Linda looking around our living room. We have lived in this house for over 40 years. Every scratch on the hardwood floor, every photo on the mantel, it all tells a story. We love this place. I reached over and took her hand. I said, Linda, do you remember how people used to think about the house of God? She nodded. We grew up in a generation where the church building was treated with such intense, almost fearful reverence. We were told to whisper. We were told that God lived up there, at the altar, or inside the sanctuary. We were taught that if you wanted to be close to him, you had to go to a specific place at a specific time. But I told her about the second massive shift that happened when the veil tore. It was the end of sacred spaces. For centuries, the presence of God was localized. It was housed in a room in Jerusalem. If you wanted the unfiltered glory of God, you had to travel to that one building. You had to stand in that one courtyard. But when the veil ripped, God was unloosed into the world. I told my family, think about it this way. When that curtain was torn apart, it was like God was breaking out of a cage we had tried to put him in. He was saying, I no longer live in temples made with human hands. I am moving out. This is a revolutionary thought for many of us, especially those of us who have spent 60 or 70 years going to a physical church building. We love our steeples and our stained glass. But the beauty of the torn veil is that the Holy of Holies is no longer a room in a distant city. The Holy of Holies is now a reality in your soul. I told Sarah, Honey, when you are driving the kids to school, or when you are sitting in your office at work, you are standing in the most holy place, because God has made his home in you. I asked James to imagine the real estate of the heart. We spent so much time worrying about the $450,000 mortgage on our physical house. But what about the house of our spirit? The Bible says that we are the temple of the Holy Spirit. That means the same glory that was behind that 60-foot curtain, the same power that made the high priest tremble, that same presence now lives inside of you. I told Linda. It means that God is not at the church waiting for us to show up on Sunday. He is in the car with us on the way there. He is at the breakfast table with us this morning. He is in the garden when we are pulling weeds. This changes everything about how we see our world. There is no longer a secular world and a sacred world. For the believer, everything is sacred. Every moment is an opportunity to be with him. Every place is a place of worship. I remember a time, many years ago, when I was feeling very far from God. I thought I had to go on a retreat. I thought I had to find a quiet chapel somewhere, far away from the noise of my life, just to hear his voice. I was looking for a sacred space. But as I sat in a busy, noisy airport, feeling exhausted and alone, I remembered the torn veil. I realized that the space right there, in that uncomfortable plastic chair, was sacred, because he was with me. The Holy of Holies was sitting in Terminal 3. I told my family that we need to stop thinking of God as someone we visit. He is someone we dwell with. I looked at the mortgage papers on the table one last time. I realized that while we were working so hard to keep this physical roof over our heads, God had already moved into our hearts, rent-free, forever. He didn't ask for a down payment. He didn't check our credit score. He just tore the curtain and walked in. I told Sarah, when you feel lonely, remember that you are never truly alone. You are carrying the presence of the Creator within you. Your heart is his favorite place to be. This is the great freedom of the new way. We are no longer tied to a building or a location. We are mobile temples. We carry the light into the darkness because the light lives in us. Linda squeezed my hand, and I could see the peace in her eyes. It is a wonderful thing to realize that you don't have to go on a pilgrimage to find God. You don't have to climb a mountain or cross an ocean. The barrier is gone. The building is empty. But the heart is full, I told them. Let's start treating our own souls with a little more reverence. Let's start recognizing that we are walking, talking, living sanctuaries of the living God. The most holy place is not somewhere else. It is right here, right now, in you. The evening air was cool, and a light breeze was rustling the leaves of the old oak tree in the front yard. I was sitting on the porch swing with James, my son-in-law. We were watching the sun go down, that beautiful, deep red and purple sky that makes you realize how small we are in this big universe. I looked at James, and I could tell he was still thinking about everything we had talked about. He is a good man. He works hard, and he cares deeply about being a good person. I told him, James, there is a verse in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 16, that changed the way I wake up. In the morning, it says we should come boldly unto the throne of grace. I let that word boldly hang in the air for a moment. I asked him, how do you think most people come to God? Do they come boldly? James thought for a second, and said he thought most people come with their hats in their hands, whispering, hoping they caught God on a good day. I nodded. That was exactly how I lived for 40 years. I came to God like a beggar. I came to him like a debtor who was 3 months behind on his payments. I would approach the throne with my head down, eyes on the floor, apologizing for everything I had ever done wrong before. I even dared to ask for a blessing. I was Rao. I was Root Ray. I was timid. But I told him, James, when the veil was torn from the top to the bottom, God was inviting us to change our posture. He was changing us from beggars into children. I went back to the story of our lawyer, Mr. Miller, and that $450,000 mortgage. I asked James to imagine two different people walking into a bank. The first person is a stranger who owes the bank $450,000 and has no way to pay it. When that person walks in, they are nervous. Their heart is racing. They are looking for an exit. They feel like everyone is judging them. They are a debtor. But then, imagine the second person. This person is the son of the man who owns the bank. When he walks through those double glass doors, he doesn't look at the floor. He doesn't wait in the long line. He doesn't ask for permission to speak. He walks right past the teller, right past the security guard, and he opens the door to his father's office. He sits down in the big leather chair, and he says, "Hey, Dad, I was thinking about having lunch today." I looked James right in the eye and said, "That is boldness. Not because the son is perfect, and not because the son owns the money. It is because of who his father is. The torn veil means that the throne of judgment has become the throne of grace." I told Sarah, my daughter, when she joined us on the porch, that this boldness is not arrogance. It is not about us being great. It is about the way being made perfect for us. We often think we can't be bold because we still have flaws. We think, well, I lost my temper this morning, or I haven't read my Bible in a week, so I better stay in the outer court today. We think our access depends on our performance, but the torn veil says the access depends on the finished work of Jesus. The path has been perfected. The price has been paid. The barrier has been removed by God himself. I told my family, if you walk into a room that someone has already opened for you, you don't have to apologize for being there. You were invited. I want you to think about that word. Inheritor. An heir doesn't beg for the house. An heir lives in the house because it belongs to the family. For so many years, I lived like a stranger who was trying to sneak into the kitchen to get a crust of bread. I was so focused on my unworthiness, of my mistakes, my Juan Nur of 450,000 spiritual dollars. I forgot that the Father had already torn up the debt. When we come to God now, we come with boldness, because we are coming home. I told Linda. It is like when we see our grandkids coming up the driveway. They don't knock on the door and ask if they are worthy to come in. They just burst through the door, yell our names, and head straight for the cookie jar. That is the heart of God for you. He doesn't want you to stand behind a curtain that he already destroyed. He doesn't want you to act like a debtor when he has already called you a son or a daughter. I told James. Next time you pray, don't start by telling God how much you don't belong there. Start by thanking him that the way is open. Stand tall. Speak clearly. You are not an intruder. You are a child of the King. Walking into his Father's room, the boldness we have is a gift. It is a legal right purchased by the blood of Christ. As the stars started to come out over our little house, I felt a great sense of freedom. The distance was gone. The begging was over. We were just family, sitting in the presence of our Father, with nothing between us anymore. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I stayed up for a little while. The house was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I was thinking about a question that had been bothering me. If the veil is truly torn, if the way is truly open, then why do we still feel so far away sometimes? Why do we still feel like God is a million miles away when we close our eyes to pray? I realized, as I sat there in the dark, that we have a habit of doing something very strange. Even though God ripped the physical veil, we spend a lot of time trying to sew it back together in our minds. We have replaced the curtain of the temple with mental veils. I thought about my own life. I thought about the times I have hung a veil of guilt between me and the Lord. I would remember something I did 20 years ago, some mistake, some failure, and I would let that memory become a thick, heavy curtain. I would tell myself, God can't possibly want to talk to me after what I did. That is a mental veil. Then there is the veil of religious performance. We think that if we didn't do enough good deeds today, then the curtain has closed again. We think we have to earn our way back into the room. We think we have to we have to sew. We have to repair the damage we think we've done. But I realize something important. God didn't rip the veil so we could try to put it back together with our good works. I told myself, Robert, stop trying to fix what God has already declared finished. I imagined standing in that ancient temple, looking at that 60-foot rip. Now, imagine if a priest came in with a needle and thread, and he started trying to sew those two pieces of heavy fabric back together. What a silly sight that would be. One man, with a tiny needle, trying to repair a 60-foot gap that the Almighty God had created. That is what we look like when we let our unworthiness keep us from prayer. We are telling God, I know you said the way is open, but I think my mistakes are stronger than your grace. I think my guilt is thicker than your love. I thought about my son-in-law, James. I know he carries a veil of performance. He feels like he always has to be doing something to prove he is a good man. I thought about my daughter, Sarah. Sometimes she carries a veil of comparison, feeling like she isn't as holy as the people she sees on television. These are all lies. These are shadows. The truth is that God is not hiding from you anymore. He is not behind the curtain, waiting for you to mess up so he can scold you. He is standing with his arms open, right in the middle of the room, waiting for you to notice that the barrier is gone. I looked at the mortgage papers again, which was still sitting on the side table. For years, those papers were a veil of stress for Linda and me. We let the worry about $450,000 become a barrier to our joy. We let the numbers on a page tell us who we were. But once the debt is paid, the paper is just paper. It has no power anymore. If you feel like God is far away, it isn't because he moved. It is because you have hung a curtain in your own heart. You have hung a veil of shame or a veil of fear. I want to tell you tonight, walk through the tear. Leave your guilt on the outside. Leave your religious checklists on the porch. Walk into the presence of God with nothing but your honest self. He didn't rip the veil because you were perfect. He ripped it because he wanted to be with you. The presence of God is no longer a danger zone for you. It is a home zone. It is a place of safety. It is a place where you can breathe. I realize that we don't have to wait until we get to heaven to experience this intimacy. We can experience it right now, in this quiet house, in this very moment. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't try to reach for God. I just realized that he was already there. The curtain was gone. The light was shining, and I was welcome. I told myself, no more sewing, no more repairs, just walking through the opening. If you are listening to this, and you feel like you are too far from God, I want you to know that the distance is an illusion. The price has been paid. The way is open. Stop standing in the outer court, acting like a stranger. Stop living as if that 60-foot wall is still there. Step through the rip. Your Father is waiting for you, and he has been waiting since that Friday afternoon, 2,000 years ago, when he reached down and opened the door forever. The night had fully arrived now, and the world outside was quiet and still. A soft, warm lamp was glowing in the corner of our living room, casting a gentle light on the faces of my family. I looked at Linda. my faithful partner of so many years. I looked at Sarah, our daughter, and James, our son-in-law. We had spent the last few hours traveling back in time, from that massive 60-foot curtain in Jerusalem to the office of Mr. Miller, our lawyer. We had talked about the debt, the $450,000 mortgage, and the heavy feeling of being an outsider, but I wanted to leave them with one final thought, the most important one of all. I leaned forward in my chair, speaking softly but with a heart full of conviction. I said, "You know, humanity viewed the presence of God as a danger zone, and they were right to feel that way. God is holy, and his glory is a consuming fire, without a way to be made clean. Standing in that fire was a terrifying thought." I asked James to think about that rope tied to the high priest's ankle one last time. I told him, "James, that rope is the ultimate symbol of a danger zone. It says that you are entering a place where you might not survive. It says that the gap between you and the Creator is so wide and so sharp that it could literally take your life. But the miracle of the torn veil is that the blood of Jesus has changed the atmosphere. The presence of God is no longer a danger zone for you. It has been transformed into a home zone." I let those words sink in. Home zone. I asked Linda to imagine coming home after a very long, very cold, and very lonely trip. Imagine pulling into our driveway, seeing the warm light in the kitchen window, and knowing that the person inside loves you more than life itself. When you walk through that front door, you don't feel afraid. You don't feel like you have to prove your worthiness. You just feel safe. You feel home. That is what the torn veil gives us. It gives us a safe place to stand. I told my family that many people still live in the outer court. They spend their whole lives standing outside the house, looking at the door, and wondering if they are allowed to come in. They are still living like strangers. They are still acting like they are under that $450,000 debt. But the price has been paid. The contract has been shredded. The door has been taken off its hinges. I looked at Sarah and said, "Honey, don't stay in the outer court. Don't live your life like a guest who is afraid to sit on the furniture. This is your Father's house. This is where you belong." I told them that the presence of God is a place where a sinner can stand before a holy God and not be consumed by fire, but be consumed by love. Think about that for a moment. Consumed by love. When you walk through that rip in the veil, you are walking into an embrace. You are walking into a relationship where you are fully known and yet fully accepted. I told James about the many times I felt like I had to clean myself up before I could pray. I thought I had to wash away the dust of the world before I could step into the presence of the Lord. But that is not how it works. We don't get clean so we can walk through the veil. We walk through the veil so we can be made new by the love that is waiting on the other side. I invited my family, right there, in our living room, to make a decision. I said, "Let's stop trying to earn our way in. Let's stop looking at the keep out signs that we have built in our own minds. Let's leave our guilt on the porch. Let's leave our unworthiness in the driveway. And let's walk through the tear together. The way is open. The distance is gone." I told them, "When I pray now, I don't feel like I am shouting at a ceiling. I feel like I am sitting on this very porch, talking to a Father who has been waiting for me to arrive. I feel the warmth of his presence just like I feel the warmth of this lamp in our living room. This is the intimacy that Jesus died to give us. It wasn't just about a religious event 2,000 years ago. It was about today. It was about this very minute. It was about giving Robert and Linda and Sarah and James a place where they are always welcome, always heard, and always loved." I looked at the mortgage papers on the side table. They seemed so small now. They seemed so insignificant compared to the glory of what we were talking about. I told my family, we might still have bills to pay, and we might still have problems to solve, but we will never, ever be alone while we do it. Because the wall is gone. The veil is torn, and we are home. Linda reached over and squeezed my hand. Sarah was smiling, and I could see the peace in James's eyes. The heaviness of the day had vanished. The greatest victory of our lives is not that we became perfect. The victory is that the perfect one opened the door for us. I told them, let's live like children in a father's house. Let's walk through the tear every single day. Let's experience the intimacy that costs so much, but is given so freely. As we prepared to say our goodnights, I felt a deep, quiet joy. The journey from the danger zone to the home zone was complete, and I knew, with everything in me, that the way would stay open forever. Well, our time together today is coming to a close. As I sit here, on this porch, watching the last bit of light fade from the sky, I feel a deep sense of peace. I look at my family, Linda, Sarah, and James, and I realize that the story we have shared is the most important one I could ever tell them. It is the story of a barrier that was removed, a debt that was settled, and a father who decided that he did not want to be far away from us anymore. I hope, from the bottom of my heart, that you can feel that same peace today. I hope you can see that the massive 60-foot curtain, that thick, heavy wall that once said, "Keep out," has been torn into two pieces forever. You do not have to live like a stranger in your father's house. You do not have to carry the weight of your mistakes like a $450,000 mortgage that you can never pay off. The price has been paid, the way is open, and the distance is gone. If this message spoke to your heart today, or if it helped you understand the freedom you have in Christ, I would be so honored if you would join our community. Please, take a moment to hit that subscribe button. It helps us reach more people who might be feeling like God is a million miles away. And if you know someone who is struggling, someone who feels like they are standing in the outer court, shivering in the shadows of their own guilt, please share this video with them. Let them know that the danger zone has become a home zone. Thank you for spending this time with me and with my family. It means so much to have you here. I truly enjoy reading your comments and hearing about where you are on your own journey. So, walk through the tear today. Leave your heavy burdens on the outside and experience the beautiful, quiet intimacy that Jesus died to give you. We will see you in the next one. Until then, may the peace of the Lord, which passes all understanding, be with you and your family. Good night, and God bless.